Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for joining our webinar today, Dispelling the Myths that Scrum Teams Don't Think About Architecture. My name is Eric Neiberg, and I'm going to moderate today's conversation. We've got a great panel set to talk to you, answer your questions, and hopefully dispel the myths about architecture. So before we get started, a little bit about Scrum.org. Our mission is really about improving the profession of software delivery, helping organizations deliver software better as a team and across teams. Software is certainly a team sport, and Scrum is all about how teams work together. And that's teams from development all the way through operations and delivery of the software. A little bit about the ScrumPulse. It's a webinar series. It's free, as you know, because you've been lucky enough to join today. It's about really increasing our focus on empiricism and agility and helping organizations and individuals learn more about what our folks today are going to talk about. You can register for and watch other webinars as well. You can see there, go to scrum.org/ScrumPulse and see all of our different webinars that are already listed. Watch them, ask questions, etc. And feel free to tweet. Some quick guidelines. Your microphones are muted throughout, so you can ask questions through the little box on the right-hand side. You can ask those questions just by typing them in. We'll take many questions throughout, as well as at the end. Each of our presenters is going to take you briefly through a little bit about themselves and a little bit about this myth, and helping to dispel that myth, and then move you forward through into that discussion. So feel free to tweet at scrum.org or just enter right into the GoToWebinar control panel under questions. So with that, I will hand it over to Peter so he can introduce himself. Peter?
Hi. Thanks, Eric. Just a couple of words about myself. I'm a professional Scrum trainer at Scrum.org. I'm giving courses like the Scrum Master course, the Product Owner course, the Developer course, and the Scaled Professional Scrum training. And I'm also an ISAQB certified software architect. For those who are not living in the German-speaking region, the ISAQB is an organization that tries to define the role of the software architect and how software architecture should be documented and worked on throughout the software delivery lifecycle. I'm a Java developer and a beekeeper, and since the beginning of this year, I am a steward for the professional Scrum developer training. And yeah, lots of the stuff that we will be talking about is stuff that we talk about in the professional Scrum developer training as well. So that's about me. I would like to hand over to, I guess, Gary.
Hi, my name is Gary Pedretti. I'm based in the US in Chicago here. I'm a PST, a professional Scrum trainer for Scrum.org also, and I teach primarily the PSD, the developer course, and the Scrum Master course. I have a wide variety of experience in the tech world, from business analysis to database analysis, coding, and infrastructure, and application architecture, and that's really sets me up as a great trainer for the PSD and gets me really excited about the PSD, which is the most interesting part there being the helping a cross-functional team, helping people understand how a cross-functional team works together, etc. And so today I will be talking about architecture, but I'd like people to think about how does an architect fit inside of a cross-functional team? How do these things happen naturally as they go throughout development? And I think turn it over to Fredrik.
And that's me. Hi, I'm based in Sweden, and I'm a Java developer like Peter, very much a Linux advocate. A PSD trainer, that's how I got introduced to Scrum.org a few years ago. Just, you know, this thing that you're teaching, Fredrik, around test-driven development and those practices, it's actually what we do as well. And then I got introduced to this great community, which, yeah. To keep it short, that's what I do. These days, I primarily work with continuous delivery, helping teams to get, one extra level of speed into what they're doing. And as part of my Scrum.org engagement, I'm the steward for the Scaled Professional Scrum course, where I try to keep it fresh and make sure we get the latest updates from our trainer community into it. And that's cue for Rich.
All right, hi everyone. I'm Rich Visotcky. As a PSD, I teach the PSF, PSM, and PSD, and hopefully soon the PSPO. I was a developer for about 10 years, always working to try to build things that people wanted and to help connect the gap a little bit between both the people that were involved in developing products, right? How software developers, architects, testers, etc., all communicated, but also how we all communicate with the business that's requesting these things. How we explain the value that certain kinds of architectural patterns or design choices ended up offering, and how we make sure that we're making choices that the business can actually go and get some good value out of in minds with what they're looking for. So now I run my own company doing that, training, speaking, coaching people through that, playing games, drinking beer, hanging out in Wisconsin, hanging out in Toronto a bit right now as well. So it's a good thing, but yeah, based right now in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, just north of Gary. Up here.
Okay, so we're going to dive right in, and let's start with this one. It's kind of related to architecture, not one-to-one mapping perhaps, but let's start with this one. I meet quite a lot of people that say, Scrum teams, they don't work with documentation. And some part of that is actually true, and some part of that may not be true. And so let's just talk about it, two things first. Scrum, the framework, if you just look it up and read the Scrum guide, you will see there's 3 artifacts that is required. You need a product backlog, a sprint backlog, and the actual product, the releasable increment. But apart from that, Scrum requires 0 documents to be produced from your team, not for the framework itself. Of course, however, your software delivery and the products you produce, they may require some kind of documentation. Be a user guide, an admin guide, installation guide. You might want to document how certain things work in UI flows or user experience, whatever it is. And that's nothing that Scrum kind of dictates what you need. You need to figure that one out yourself for your context, for your product, for your market. Yeah, so most Scrum teams that I do meet and figure this out, they do work with documentation, and they, as lean and agiles who try to do it, there are different ways to document things. So I have 3 examples of how I see successful teams work with living lightweight documentation. So next slide, please. And this is a simple example of how you could, get a sense of how your full system looks like, how your full, perhaps even environment looks like, your ecosystem, your universe. Just ask someone who knows about it, stand up, talk to a whiteboard and describe what are the components, what are the parts of the system that really makes this work. If you do this, you'll find it's a lightweight thing to do. You just need a video recorder and a way to upload it to a shared folder somewhere, document it on your wiki or whatever you're using. Typically, you'll find that you will get enough details while doing this. You will also, it will be enough correct, meaning some things are going to be outdated if you don't do it, update it every other day. That's fine, because ideally we want to have these really good conversations and not get stuck into the perfect documentation, which is always going to be out of date at one point or another. So most teams that I see do this, they update it regularly with some cadence. One example that you might have heard of is Spotify. They have this click-to-play video introduction that almost everyone that is introduced to the company has been through. So there's one person that describes what happens when I click the play button. What code is exercised? What A/B testing? Where do we store this information? Where do we get the data from? Where do we get the audio from? How does all of this connect? Where do we do DNS? Where do we do caching? All of that. So it's really an introduction to the full universe of Spotify, and it takes about an hour to walk through. and they update this every second or month or so. So that's just one example of living lightweight documentation. Another is something I'm sure you've all seen, I've used at some point in time, and that is actually to put the thing up on the whiteboard. If you have a whiteboard or 2 or 3 in your room, great. I've seen several teams that have come up with this kind of similar schematics of how they work with it. They draw up the components, typically black or blue, etc., and then they, for the current sprint, they mark the things they're going to work on with red, like highlight these areas we're going to work on. Let's make this red to make sure we don't step on each other's toes, etc. And then they also take another pen, green or yellow, and mark this is what we're going to change it into. So you have both the current state, what's being worked on, and what we're going towards. And at the end or in the beginning of the sprint, you take a photo of this, and you will get a nice set of screenshots or photos that you can just flicker through for history if you want to do that, etc. And lastly, kind of related is working with plastic pocket. What I mean by that, I actually have this one here. So it's nothing fancy, but at the place in the room where you have a Scrum board and you do your daily work, have these plastic pockets available to you. So whenever you're going to work on this one, number 312, I think it is, just pull this one up and you have all your architecture sketches, your UI sketches, your flows, etc. It's all available to you. So I find many teams find it's really lightweight, easy, very accessible. You can pull this in easily when you do refinement, etc. And it's all handmade, easy, throw away, redo, low cost to produce until you kind of approach your being done. When the work is almost completed, the last step of your definition done might be to actually take a photo of this or put it in Dropbox, or you take a photo and you paste it somewhere in your document, or you might take your hand-drawn thing, turn it into more electronic version and put it in our enterprise architect or something. So those are 3 examples of working, lightweight, low cost, up until the point where you have the work completed and it's done, it's working. That's when you might take some extra investment and document it. But of course, this is just 3 examples, right? They work in their context, and other teams, they want to do something more. So Peter, you have more experience of in this nice framework.
Yeah, so I'm mainly working with companies that are in a regulated environment, like medicine technology or medical tools and systems, or the automotive industry, or the air traffic industry, so aviation and stuff. And here, while I really appreciate the lightweight approach that Fredrik just talked about, because this is something that everybody can do spot on and without any technical hurdles, usually my customers, they have to create something more complete, let's say complete. We will talk about completeness of software architecture, I guess, in the discussion. And whenever I start talking about software architecture, I ask myself, what is the quality goal? So what are we trying to achieve here? Because the software architecture, it mirrors a lot the requirements that we have to our quality. So maybe for some applications and systems, usability is the highest quality value that we can create. Maybe for another system, efficiency, performance, runtime efficiency is of highest value. And maybe for another one, maybe for a bank, security and reliability is the highest value that they can create. And so a very good, let's say, glossary, which quality goals you might have in your application and system is the ISO 25010. It has been evolved over the last couple of years. This is the latest, the latest version that you see on my slide. And think about what are the 3 to 5 most important quality goals that you want to reach. Eric, can we go up to the next? And then, based on these quality goals, you define in the first step, and this is something you can do easily in a couple of hours, maybe a day or 2. So this is something that you just can do in the first sprint. you define what is your system. So that's the blue box here on the slide. How is the system constrained? So are there any technical decisions? Are there any business requirements, any business constraints, or other constraints, security constraints, that maybe even people constraints that you have to take into account? Write them down, get a view on them, look at how they influence the scope and context of your application. Think about who else is working with your system. So which users are using it, which other systems are there that have to be taken into account, and make a business and a technical context, describe it, and then break it down into smaller parts. Eric, next slide, please. Because what we then do, and this is still, you can do it easily in the first couple of days of the first sprint, and you can refine it over and over again. I will show you on the next slide. We usually have to think about what are the building blocks of our systems. These are usually like these Russian dolls. These are a decomposition of the context of the system. And you open up the system box, you look into it, you have the first white box view on the system. Then maybe you want to dig deeper, and the different components that make up the overall system, you look into them. Maybe for some of the runtime features, it's interesting to have a deeper look at them and define how they work together. That's the upper right corner. Maybe it's interesting how stuff is deployed, so you can document that. And obviously, it makes sense to document your cross-cutting concepts like logging, persistence, security, whatever. This is something that you can do upfront in a very limited way. So you do it in the first sprint, usually up to a certain point. So much that you can get started. And then, Eric, next slide, please. And then usually what you do, I call it architecture pretzel. I'm from Bavaria, so I'm into pretzels a lot. I'm into beer as well, so Rich and I will have a chat afterwards, but I'm into pretzels. And this is just an image that I have stolen from Stefan Todt, a colleague of mine here in Germany. And he says, you have from the top, you have the requirements coming into your development cycle. And typically what we do in sprint planning is we find out from the product backlog, what could we do to reach a certain sprint goal, and then we work on that. And during the work of the development team, there are two different cycles. There is the implementation cycle and there is the architecture cycle. Many teams only focus on the implementation cycle. They just put stuff into their systems. What I would advise everybody to do is to also think about architecture. This is not separated from each other. So I don't like to have some ivory tower architect, enterprise architect guys who are sitting somewhere, but I like to do that in the team, in the development team. And both of them are feedback cycles, basically. So you have a feedback cycle about the product increment at the end of the sprint. You have feedback cycles while you are watching and challenging your own architecture based on the quality goals that you have. And so basically, this is the idea of working on architecture that I implement with my teams. I just realized that I have forgotten one thing. It's the name. There is a template to it. I will just put it into the. I will just put it into the chat window so that everybody has it afterwards. It's the ARC42 template. So, and with that, I hand over to I think Gary, Rich. I don't know.
Yeah, and I'm going to talk about a particular myth and a single experience that I've had. But before I do that, I want to go back. I want to start at the beginning, and I'll relate a personal story here that might help us understand sort of where I come from and maybe get on the same page. And in around 2000, early 2000s, I was interested in Scrum. I read one of the original books, the Schwaber Beetle book, the black book with the colored words on the front, and found it very interesting. Thought it was some good stuff. And then around in 2006, I took a Scrum Master class with Ken. And one of the biggest things I took away from that is a realization that other people understood things sort of as I did in terms of architecture. And I'm kind of paraphrasing here, but one of the things he said was basically architectural ideas aren't valid. They're not valid nor are they validated until they're proven out in a working system. And given my experience in building software and with application architecture, etc., I found that to be very true. And in fact, it's kind of been understood and understood that this is true, and we can't do all of the design and be certain of what's going to happen and what needs to be there, and we're probably going to have to iterate around that. The architect might come up with some ideas, we do a little bit of coding, we find these ideas are good, but some of these ideas over here need to be tweaked a little bit, etc. That there's an iterative nature to that. In fact, we've known that, and it's been codified since at least 1970. And the diagrams here are from Royce's paper about team software development, which is the paper that is generally considered to be the place where waterfall was sort of codified or started. He didn't use the term waterfall, but you can see from these diagrams how people would start to use that. But explicitly in that paper, he talked about how there needed to be iteration between successive steps and non-successive steps, which is the left picture and the right picture, respectively. So we've known this for a long time. The only question that's left is, how are we going to make this happen? How do we do this and still maintain levels of quality, focus on things like quality, like what Peter's talking about, what are our primary goals in terms of quality, things like Fredrik is talking about, how are we going to document this, but even more so, how are we going to communicate this out to people, share the understanding around those things. These are really the only questions left. And I'll talk about a particular issue here, if you want to advance the slide there, Eric. And it's a tale of two teams and one product. And I'm going to talk about a common problem here. The myth, going back to the theme of the webinar, I think the myth here is that Scrum teams do whatever they want. And self-organization means we get to choose whatever we do, and we just do whatever we want, and everything's great. And the situation that we had was two teams working on a single product, and so they were cutting across all of the layers of the product, and down at the data access layer and the data source, one team wanted to use a ORM tool, an object relational mapper called NHibernate. The other team wanted to use the entity framework. So you can tell this probably was a .NET project. And they had some very strong feelings, and they wanted to use these two. And what do you think about that, right? And we heard the typical sort of pushback around that, where doing that, you're just kind of allowing people to do whatever they want. You're creating an application which is going to be hard to maintain in the future. It's going to be harder to onboard people. We might not be able to share resources or have people float between those teams easily, etc. These are common problems that people will bring up. My question to that is kind of, well, okay, but so what? And if you advance there, Eric, what's the cost of change here? Let's say that these two teams work with these two different ORMs and continue forward. The issue that I see oftentimes is that we use Scrum, we use iterative processes, which are about limiting risk, and limiting risk inside of iterations, inside of sprints, etc. We use these things but we don't see, we kind of forget about the larger picture, and which is what do those things give us? We forget about the larger picture, and we still think about things like architectural decisions in a standard waterfall or big design, big risk, big decision sort of mindset. And I would remind people here that, let's say that we let these teams run for a while. The sprint is 4 weeks or less. What's at risk? What's the cost? And both the cost of building this in two separate ways, and the cost of, let's say, reconciling that later and say, okay, now we'd like to use this. We can see that this is the best choice. Let's get the data access layer to be consistent here. The cost of that change or that reconciliation is also very low. It's no longer we're making a decision and we assume that we're going to live with it for 2 years, right? Use the power of the fact that you're iterating and that whole system sort of view, right? Of you're iterating, you have less investment, you have less risk, you have a lower cost of change. Think about those things. The other thing I would recommend is think about, is there a more important dimension here? And if you look at the data access layer, how about wrapping an ORM tool with something like a repository pattern? That's, in my opinion, that figuring that out, and whether you use the repository pattern or not is completely beside the point. But my point is, thinking about those sorts of issues will be far more important than the ORM that you choose. And if I go ahead and use that example, the repository pattern, and we think about some of those original objections, this is going to be hard to maintain, people won't be able to onboard quickly, you got these different technologies here, etc. Now you can really see, using something like a repository pattern, which was championed by the domain-driven design sort of movement, and takes your data access layer and states it in concepts, in phrases that are important to your particular domain. Having a good repository pattern, maybe wrapping an ORM with good descriptive method names, understanding what does the domain need to do, that's going to be far more important for somebody onboarding and understanding an application than the type of ORM that you're using. Right? And so now I've kind of said, if you go back there, I've kind of talked about, if you go back one more, Eric. Is there a more important dimension? The other thing I would recommend, taking from this story, think about licensing. Maybe licensing is an issue. Turns out this client was not willing to go to bat for a reciprocal open source license. So GPL, LGPL are reciprocal licenses. Things like the MIT license are non-reciprocal, meaning just do whatever you want with it. There's no expectation that you'll give back to the community. And Hibernate was under GPL or LGPL, and this was a large company, and they weren't willing to go to bat for being like one of the first companies to really test the limits of that reciprocal license. And so that kind of solved itself. Another interesting point here is that was unforeseen at the beginning, and we're often going to deal with unforeseen things. We're often going to deal with rework, whether we want to or not. It's a matter of acknowledging reality there. So I've talked about kind of two things. What's the cost of change? Is there a more important dimension? Kind of, so what? You know, just go ahead. I might sound like a cavalier sort of person, just let everyone do whatever they want. No, that's not all I'm saying. You could want consistency for the reasons I talked about or for some other reasons. And let's say that you allow those teams to run and figure things out inside their respective data access layers during this time. Can we still bring it back? Can we still get consistency? And the answer is, of course, yes, we can. The things to think about: setting expectations. So as opposed to, I think Peter mentioned sort of an enterprise architect sort of sitting in an ivory tower and sort of handing things down, handing dictates down and things like that. It doesn't necessarily work so well with technical people. Setting expectations, though, sort of is really in the spirit of self-organization, defines a context, defines a boundary, and allows the team to figure out how they might make that happen. And an expectation could be as high level as, I expect that you two teams are going to get together, you're going to talk, and you're going to figure out how to make this application as maintainable as possible. That could be a fairly high level one. You could also potentially set a lower level expectation, which is, you know, by 3 months in here, I would expect that we would have centered on a particular ORM technology, and we are either all of our data access is using that ORM technology, or all of it is moving in that direction. That could be a lower level expectation. And think about, how do you build consensus? I know that technical people like to argue about this tool versus that tool, and I think there's probably a lot of work that our industry could do in terms of figuring out, how do you build consensus as a group? How do you talk to people? Etc. How do I set aside a decision as, I don't agree with this completely, but for the sake of the team, I'm going to go forward with it, so that we don't revisit the fact that you didn't choose my preferred tool over and over again. I'm sure you've all seen that. One pattern that people use yeah, I see Fredrik smiling. I think he wants to have the tabs versus spaces debate right now. We got a half hour left? Let's see. No, just kidding. Well, one pattern that people will use, and it has this name, I think the Spotify model might call it something a little bit different, but the basic idea, communities of practice. And forget about the title, I don't care. Forget about a proper noun here. Communities of practice are just like-minded people getting together and talking about their experiences. That's all it is. And in a, say, single product, multiple team scenario, you might have communities of practice that get together and talk about that particular product. And a common thing might be for different specialists in different areas, whether that be UI or data access, whether that be the customer base, anything, get together and talk about their experiences in that sort of specialized area within the context of the product. And a standard can emerge pretty quickly and pretty easily through a community of practice, through just setting aside some time where, let's sit down and let's talk about this. Let's share our experiences. Let's talk about what's really happened when I used NHibernate, and I want to learn what you learned when you used the entity framework, etc. What were the pros and cons in the context of this product? Also in the context of actually building something. So this is different from, say, building a prototype and making a bunch of assumptions and using very simple use case scenarios and very simple sets of data to say, oh yeah, it looks like this one is the right tool. This has the potential to be much more rich, because it's going to be based on experience building your actual product. So those are some ideas about, if we want consistency, how do we get there now if we've allowed people to make decisions and experiment as they've gone along. And with that, I think Rich is going to talk about something kind of similar, and maybe even like maybe more pervasive, in talking about sort of system rewrite and rebuilding systems and things like that, which I think is quite a bit related to this. Rich?
Sure, thanks, Gary. Yeah, I wanted to piggyback off of that specific concept right there, and something that seems to be a prime concern for a lot of business people and architects that I have met, that they don't want to spend too much money building the wrong thing, right? You know, that let's try to go and figure out as much as we can here so that we minimize the amount of rework, that we build the right thing, that we have a nice high-quality system from the start. And in the case of, that Gary pointed out, the NHibernate versus entity framework decision, you have two teams choosing different technologies, kind of seeing what plays out, right? And what might be a better fit. I'm not positive there's another time where you have unforeseen rebuilds, right? Where there are things that come up that you can't really plan for. A vendor changes their product substantially. You have new or more fitting technology that comes up. You have teams that just gain more competence in a certain area and realize the results of their decisions and need to make a technology or even a structural change there. I've got personal experience with this, with replacing a database. Under the hood, we went from a relational database and using SQL to store a bunch of product information to needing to use a graph store because we were much more concerned with the relationships, and that was what the business was kind of after, was how all these things were connected. That was a pretty substantial change we had to make. I have a client that's going through this with their workflow engine. They've been building up a product in Java, right? Some services there, and are realizing that some of the complexities and things that they're trying to do are the team's just not sure how they're going to start building some of this stuff out, and they found another product that is meant for doing workflows and involving multiple client and account interactions, account manager interactions, in order to go and see this workflow out effectively, that they thought, maybe we should go and move to. And no one thought about this, right? Everyone did the best they could to try to build the best and most valuable product possible, going along the whole way, thinking this through and whatnot. And now you're faced with this change, right? What do you do? How do you move things along? And no matter what we're doing here, we have to think that we need to keep adding value to the product, right? No one wants to go and spend more than we need to. Everyone wants to still be able to go and get something usable out of this. We also have to make sure we have the product shippable. We can't just go and say, hey, new technology, it seems like it would be a lot of fun to go and do this rewrite. Let's just shut down all future, all feature work here for a couple months while we just completely restructure our whole code base. You can't deal with that. No one is willing to accept that kind of scenario now, especially in markets that are so dynamic. So we want to make sure we keep our product shippable and that functionality that is already there still maintained, still usable by any clients that we might have. Because let's say we have other third-party clients, or we're a team that's providing services to another team. And going through this, we need to understand why, right, and communicate effectively why we're making this kind of change. Being able to describe what types of things, the reason that we're actually looking to make this change, not just it looks fun, right, this is the new JavaScript framework of the day, but it's something that actually has value, that there's a major cost potentially into continuing the way that we're doing things now, that there's some other benefit that we're looking to go and achieve that actually helps both the team and the business out in getting this thing forward. So with that in mind, if you can go to the next slide, just some ideas on maybe how you can go and start achieving these types of large changes incrementally. Branch by abstraction is a good concept that usually works here, right? And that's just a good professional development pattern, right? Whether you're a software developer or an architect or whatnot, that's something you can start using and thinking about ahead of time. But if you don't, you can start figuring out how to get in there to come up with that abstraction layer, to come up with some kind of interface that you then start building new suppliers for and start migrating your clients off over time. And the diagrams are up there thanks to Martin Fowler's blog post on that. Great post on branch by abstraction and sort of why you would use that, and how it can help you continue to keep your code shippable, work in the main line, and build out these new suppliers alongside, while you still have the value of what you had before. So that's one thing there. I like to always treat vendor products as well as black boxes, right? Because you're not controlling their code, you might not have access to it, and so you don't know if they're going to make a change, when that change is going to come along, what it might do to you. So finding ways to go and separate yourself there and provide the right amount of testing around it, but also know just what kind of interaction you're looking for there are important things when you're working with vendor products, or even products and services from other teams within your company that you might not be able to go and have access to right now. And so thinking about what your interface looks like there and how you go and what else could come in to fill that need could be big. One thing that helped us when we were doing that database replacement was using existing tests as documentation of expected functionality. Right? We had a ton of tests around our services that helped describe the way our consumers were using our data and the types of responses, et cetera, we were looking to provide them. So as we created this abstraction and started providing new systems to go and feed this information in, we were using that test to make sure, hey, how can we start building this thing up? What do we need there? Right? And use that to guide decisions around what we were going to be building out and how we needed to build that. And that helped influence the architecture that we were going and creating as we were building new pieces of functionality. So that was really nice. And if you're ever in a part where you do need to make these kinds of structural changes, it's not a bad idea to just wrap things in a test and start using that as a guide of, hey, it's okay to change the structure, but this is still the functionality that we need to get out of it in the long run. And then lastly, it's okay, I think, to think about building functionality alongside existing functionality, right? That you have an idea of something that you want to build up, and you can go and start creating that in a new area. And if you're going through the right abstractions, the right kind of separation of concerns between your clients and your suppliers, you can start building things up along the side, and your clients will never know. A client of mine is currently going through that as they're moving over towards this new workflow system. They're keeping their existing Java system up in line. It has value, right? It's already built. It's doing exactly what it wants to do. But as they take on some of these new tasks, they're building that up alongside and finding ways to go and aggregate that together so that clients don't have to care, right? And any business user doesn't know what's going on behind the scenes. They're still getting the valuable functionality that they want. But we're continuing to evolve this architecture, right, and communicate about how these things go through. Should we be maintaining both of these? Is there a time in which it's appropriate to start replacing the old system with the new system, or does it make sense to keep these things as they are because they work, right? And what's the overhead cost of that? So thinking about how that gets built up and having a nice, good amount of effective communication about this, bringing it up constantly, really helps teams understand what the whole structure of their system looks like, as well as helps the business make good and appropriate choices about what should they do and where should they invest into the actual structure of their system. So that's just a little story and some tips and things you might want to try there. We'd like to jump into the QA, so just want to go and remind everyone there's a question box that's here in the GoToWebinar presentation. We actually already have one question up here. Thanks, Arnaud. And I'd like to go and jump right into that. The question is what percentage of the sprint, or what percentage of the sprint can be spent on architecture? And that's an interesting question. And the basic answer that I can provide to that is I would never spend the entire sprint on architecture alone, and I never spend the entire sprint building up features and not caring for the architecture, right? You want to always have some balance between value that's being delivered out to somebody, even if it's a really, really small amount, and you need to spend a lot of time being a professional in your system and doing changes, building up things, moving stuff around, right? That's all the work you need to do to make sure you get this little piece of value out here. And I think that's fine. You may have also times where you have a good structure underneath the hood, and you're continuing to add new features and such, but if you don't think about how are these new additions impacting your existing structure and architecture and communicating back out how that might have changed the look, you may build yourself into a spot where things are messy, and that's where you get into those kinds of, oh, we really should have thought this out, we should have been doing this. Well, you need to do that all the time, much like Peter was mentioning. Go to that pretzel and have things that you're building into the product feed new architectural discussions that you have to go forward and make sure that this is a maintainable and high-quality system. So that's one question. Thank you, Arnaud, for going and asking that.
So I just want to hand that over to Peter a little bit as well, because he talked about some of this in his pretzel. I think it was the pretzel model. So Peter, did you have some thoughts on that as well? Does it fit into the pretzel?
Yeah, the problem with the pretzel is now I have food in my mind and I'm a bit disconcentrated, but that's fine. So I fully agree with Rich. So I would never go for 100%. I would never go for a 0%. I have an example. I have worked with a customer in the past. They built diagnosis software for stuff like forklifters and these little cars that can transport stuff up and down. And so in the first sprint, the development team had to set up everything. They had to set up their environment, their infrastructure, and their architecture. They had to get the licenses to work, and all of this stuff. And a lot of the work in that sprint was architectural work. So we thought about how do we communicate between the notebook of the service technician and the forklifter, and what's the protocol, and how does it work? Is there a library for that? What are the basic principles that we will incorporate, and so on and so on. And the team, I was their Scrum Master, and the team said, yeah, at the end of the sprint we will deliver the architecture documentation in the first draft of it. And I said, that's not good enough, because it's not a releasable increment, because no consumer, no customer, no service technician would like to go with an architecture documentation to the customer and repair their forklifters. And so the thing is, I said, think about it a bit more. So what can you deliver? And so in the end, they delivered a technical cut-through through all of the different areas. They were able to attach the forklifter. They had a plug-and-play demonstration where the forklifter told the notebook its name, its serial number, and then this serial number was used to get the name from the database, and it was used to get more information, like an image from the file. It was some kind of file management software. So a document management system, yeah, that's it. And so we had all the different components combined in the sprint. At the end of the day, the releasable increment was just an empty window where, when I plugged in the forklifter, I could see the serial number, the name, and an image of the forklifter attached. But it had all the quality attributes. It had all the work done that had to be done in order to get this information. So I would say that was like 80% of architectural work and only like 5% of really implementation. Usually, the more and more product development matures and goes on, the amount of architectural work will degrade. It will decline a bit. Unless we have something that really changes drastically, like Rich said. So I think that's basically it. Not 0, not 100. It depends.
Sorry, go ahead, Peter. So we've got some more questions come in. I want to make sure we can hit as many as we can. So I'm going to give this one to Fredrik, and then others can chime in. But since you're the steward of the Scale Professional Scrum class, and this is related to that, but let's hit it with you first. When you work in a Nexus, if an architect working in a team, of course, has a different opinion from most of the Nexus team members, should we give priority to the many brains or to the role?
Yes. That's a tricky one, of course. I think you should always use empiricism whenever you can. So perhaps you could ask yourself, what would be the cost if you build both solutions? Have one team runway would do one solution and the other team runway with another solution, and we can look at them when we have the real code. It's like when you go to a coding dojo and you actually practice code. Code always win over abstract conversations, right? So perhaps this is one option that you could go for. I had a client where they could never stop debating whether they should go route A or route B in whatever technology they were discussing. And at some point, I actually told them that this specific thing, we're talking about build systems. We've actually spent more time debating this than if we would just have gone out, built it, 3 people this solution and 3 people with that one. Can't we just do that now instead and see what we think of the solutions once they're actually put in place and they're working? So, of course, I would love to go with the intelligence of brains of the many. That's my preference. Sometimes that might be wrong. Time will tell, right? But don't be afraid to actually go after both solutions, or just write, the first 2 or 3 things using both solutions to see what it turns out and what it feels like. I think that's what I would like to do.
I'll just add, I'll just add that in a healthy cross-functional team, somebody who, say, has some architecture expertise will sort of naturally be deferred to, right? If they're a good leader, they have experience in that. A lot of these things will just naturally happen, meaning the architect doesn't need to lay down a dictate. The team will naturally look to them for certain things, and they will naturally look to the UX person and naturally weigh their opinion more for certain UI and workflow sort of decisions. So if you're in one of those specialized roles, think about how you can be a steward and a servant leader, and also how you can build consensus. Make your case, build consensus.
Yeah, and a quick vehicle for actually doing that, tying back to what you said previously, Gary, is through community of practices, right? One way where you can actually try these things out perhaps might be through one of those community of practice that they decide, let's set this up, we want to take this further, we cannot find a simple answer that we all agree on, so let's try both. Let's do it in the architecture community practice.
I think that's great, guys, and when we think of Scrum and both the empirical nature of Scrum, so that we're all working together, reviewing and learning from each other, is certainly critical to that, but also it's all about team. And respecting the team and gaining the respect of the team, looking at those Scrum values of respect, and that architect's part of that team for a reason, and bringing them in. So Gary, you talked about patterns first, so I'm going to bring this question to you, and then others, again, feel free as always to chime in, not that you're ever going to be quiet. Is there a good pattern for involving analysts and architects work into the sprint where the implementation is going on? I mean, analysis and architecture are kind of tasks you should have covered before running the implementation, right?
Again, think about how those things inform each other, and think about how you might be setting yourself up for some failure, or some unrealistic expectations if you think that you can do all the analysis and architecture before you do some of the implementation. So the thing I would recommend here is that, yeah, in the general class of the question is, I'm doing some work, I feel like I have to do it before this other work happens. That's the nature of my work, and that's, you know, that's generally, that's how people understand it. How do I do this? Challenge yourself. You'll be very surprised when you start to work closer with the team. Also challenge yourself in terms of this concept of just enough, having just enough analysis, having just enough architectural design or thought behind something, and then starting it, and start to build it, put it into an implementation, and that leaves you many more options to deal with, to actually adapt to what you find when you start to implement it. That said, another great myth, tying this back to the myths here, another great myth of Scrum in general is that, oh, you guys can only see, you know, 2 weeks into the future. You just build something for 2 weeks and then you run around like a chicken with your head cut off, and you know, that sort of thing. Yeah, you got blinders on, all this stuff. That can be true if you don't do product backlog refinement, formerly known as grooming. So oftentimes you'll have pushback with people talking about refinement. Should the whole team really be there? Like, can't just a BA do that or something like that? Think about refinement as something a little bit larger, a little bit more comprehensive. You're building domain knowledge. You don't want to go down to the level of, say, creating tasks of we should do this and then do that, sort of implementation tasks, so that sort of thing. But thinking about the design, thinking about how does this fit in with existing subsystems that we already have, all of that stuff is really important stuff to do inside of product backlog refinement. So if you kind of can't get beyond the mental thing of there's this work, I have to do it ahead of time, challenge yourself to work inside the sprint, but then also realize that refinement is there as the forward-looking piece, and figure out how you can do small bits of this typical or your typical sort of work inside of refinement together with the team, building up that knowledge across the team.
So Rich, kind of tying into that previous question and what was just talked about, how do we keep rework costs low if we can't define the architecture or aren't defining that architecture up front?
So I think part of that goes into what I was talking about earlier, right? And as well what Fredrik was mentioning. I think of just building stuff out and always making sure we're getting some little piece of value. And nothing tells you that your architecture works quite like having working code, right? And so starting to come up with some ideas, even going to the concept of, like I said, you're going to be building something out here. As Gary mentioned, use product backlog refinement as an opportunity to do some whiteboarding, to have an open discussion, to share ideas, and to help cross-train skills with each other into building up, like getting an idea of what you're going to build, so that when you go to build this thing, everyone's got a good, understanding, and you're likely to make a more informed choices, right? That you can go through, build something up, and get some value out of it, so that even if you need to make a change later, usually that change has some additional value to it, right? And so the rework question to me, or that kind of concept to me, more implies that we did something wrong in the first place. And if I look at, we're building up our architecture on a system incrementally, we're always focused on building something of value, we made a choice to go and get something out there, right? To prove that this worked, to deliver some value out to our market, to get something back out of that. And then when we need to make a new choice, it's not rework, it's a new decision that influences a change in structure, a change in functionality. And so you're not really reworking anything, but you are making changes. There is a cost to that, and you're doing it specifically because you want to get some additional value. So just bringing these questions up as early as possible, and making sure that you're using things like product backlog refinement and open conversation across your whole team to kind of get a forward look and some more understanding about and information about the decisions you're making, helps make sure that you're always building a product, even if you are changing portions of a product, that are in a valuable spot. Fredrik, you had something else to add?
So I was going to, oh, go ahead, Fredrik. You good? Okay. So I think we've probably got time for one more, and I think this ties to this whole conversation we've been having, and it also it's one that comes up just all of the time. So I'm going to use this last question. So I'll address this to Peter first, and then others again jump in. Why can't we just have a sprint zero where we define our architecture up front and just be done with it?
Because we will never be done with it. Next. Oh, I mean, I like hearing myself talking, so I will elaborate a bit on that. So the thing is, architecture is something that's hard to change, but it's not impossible to change, as we heard from Rich's example, or from Gary's example, by the way. So the thing is, to think without all of the information that we need to get the right solution in place is just not possible. It's a myth. And that's why architecture is something that is ongoing work. It is a collaborational work. So software architecture, in my opinion, is most about communication, and it's not about modeling. And that's why I think it's something that goes alongside every sprint. And the danger I see is that if we start with a sprint zero, we end up with sprint minus n. And I have seen that in the past. I've seen that where we worked in 2-week sprint cycles for half a year, sprint minus 26, sprint minus 25, 24, and so on, because we had to get the stuff right. In the end, it was wrong. So it's not possible.
Anybody have anything to add to that?
I guess I would add that sprint zero has fallen out of fashion, and whether you do sprint zero or you don't do sprint zero, I have an opinion, but I'm not going to cry if you do sprint zero. I will start to cry if you do what Peter's talking about, which is you have 0.1, 0.2, or I like that negative 24. That's innovative. If you do stuff like that, yeah, now you've got a big problem there. But the idea of no sprint zero is really just a challenge to you. The challenge is you can deliver feature functionality a lot quicker than you think you can. Just accept the challenge. go ahead, try it. You can deliver feature functionality a lot sooner than you think you can, and while you do it, you can verify some of the abstract in the cloud sort of decisions that you might need to make or that you want to make.
Fredrik?
Yes, I think of this whole thing back to agility, ability to change. I think we talk about this in the PSD class. There are some patterns that will help you build a more modular, more adaptable, changeable system. And so to the question that Rich had, the cost of rework. Sure, there's a cost. There's a learning that's happening. You should celebrate that, right? Because next time, hopefully, we'll be more informed and make better decisions. But you also always have to weigh this to what's the cost of not changing. What would the impact on the product, our speed, and our just happiness and code quality, whatever it is. Think about what's the cost of not changing as well. And again, value your agility or not.
Great. Well, thank you all. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our audience. Just a quick reminder, we have many professional Scrum training classes available, over 170, I think it's over 180 professional Scrum trainers like the folks here on the call today, all working around the world that help you understand and better improve the way you deliver software. Real quick, there is a course that's very specific around architecture called our Professional Scrum Developer Training course. It looks at the different development practices and the tools that come into that. Check it out. We're all here on this call are all PSD, Professional Scrum Developer Trainers as well. It can certainly help you and guide you in that way. And with that, connect to the community. Jump on the forum, ask your questions. They're always being monitored and watched and answered by the expert community. Read the blog. Many of us on this call today are blogging and always adding more content, and just keep on learning. So with that, I want to say again, thank you, and Scrum on.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Thanks, people. Thank you.